My voice fought through the haze of rain clashing against the branches as I shouted at Charlie to run. We were both dashing hastily through the dark, drenched forest that was soaking us to the skin. We must have run for 15 minutes in a state of pure terror. You never get used to ghosts. It's a fear that cannot be comprehended. As fascinated as you are, you don't beg to stick around. We ran for that very reason. At some point, through blind fear, we must have gotten separated. The last thing one would want is to be alone in these woods with whatever it was we just saw. I shouted for him again. "Charlie! Did you see that? What the hell was that?" But I heard no voice in return. I shouted his name at the top of my lungs again as I ran, frenzied, through the darkness. Before I knew it, I slipped over a branch and fell headfirst into the dirt, scattering my camera ahead of me into the soggy foliage. I struggled onto my knees, panting for air, and scrabbled towards it, plucking it out of the undergrowth and placing it into the breast of my jacket. I turned around as I clicked my flashlight on, knees digging into the soaking wet ground. My eyes scanned around the dimly lit trees I had just ran through. The lashing rain made my eyes squint. Trees and white streaks of rain were all I could see within the faint torchlight. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps looming and branch rustles growing louder from behind me. I heard a voice echo the words, "Joe, let's go!" It was Charlie. Thank God. He dragged me to my feet by my collar and arm, and we began sprinting towards the edge of the forest. It felt like I was wading through a murky river, like the ground was trying to pull me under its roots. Eventually, we made it out to an opening. I was exhausted, on the verge of collapse, and struggling to yank breath down into my lungs. We stood panting in the middle of the country road, waiting for one of us to start talking. I beat him to it. "Did you see what I saw? That man, that tall man. Christ, Charlie." With a wide-eyed glare, he nodded his head and asked me if I'd captured the grisly vision on my camera. I told him I think I did, but that we'd have to view the footage back at the inn. "The camera. I needed to check it." I grabbed it out of my jacket and could tell damage had already occurred. "Oh, damn." Charlie asked me what was wrong as he gasped for air. I held my head in my hand as I realized the camera had been soaked through. The profanity smashed dead against the wall of rain that was descending from above us. He said, with haste, that we needed to get out of here. We promptly made ourselves scarce from the forest entrance. We dragged ourselves back to the inn through the dark country roads, our torches weakly lighting up the tarmac in front as we chased it. I could only hear our footsteps echoing through the darkness and splashes of rain against the trees all around us. It was an atmospheric chill to the senses. It was only a half-hour walk, but it felt like a decade. I felt scared and told Charlie that I definitely saw something back there, without question. He told me he did too. He was spooked. We both were. We didn't have many words for one another. Charlie and I used to do ghost hunts quite often a few years back before he got married. I knew he was still fond of the game, even to this day. We both were. I even tried to set up a ghost hunting business with him, but it didn't work out. Our sightings of anything remotely paranormal during that time were minimal, and we didn't have most of the equipment. I don't think many folk were flattered by Charlie and I. We were like the geeks you'd find in a comic book store at the age of 32, a slapstick version of the real deal. It was a part-time hobby for us now. We were best friends, and had been since we were kids. We still got a pretty big kick out of ghost hunting. That is, until today. We eventually got back to the Owl's Gate Inn after a treacherous journey back through the drowning Shire. It was a quaint country pub with old-fashioned rooms and a vintage charm. I think it was mostly locals who came here since this place was so far from the city. We were pretty far away from home, but it was nice to feel the comforts of the Shire folk. The inn was a very cosy place, a log fire going near the weathered wooden tables and a relaxing, inviting atmosphere. The inn was completely surrounded by forest, of course, and it was located at the bottom of two steep roads coming from both directions, more or less just plonked at the bottom of a huge dip. The exterior of the building was wrapped in luscious ivy, and there was a small bridge to the left of the river which ran through the forest greenery. We could have picked a lot worse. We hurried through the open wooden door to the porch of the inn and welcomed the feeling of safety it offered. There was a lovely smell of home-cooked food wafting through the bar area. We greeted the barman we met earlier today when booking in before making our way up to our room. As soon as the key turned in the lock, I rushed over to my bed, yanked the wires out, and began drying the camera with a towel. Charlie took over drying it so I could jump in the shower and change out of the sodden rags I was wearing. He started hooking it up to the outdated silver television nestled in the corner and was still messing on with it, trying to make it work when I came back into the room. All of a sudden, static white noise shook the foundations. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end and my legs turned to jelly. "Charlie, turn it the hell down for God's sake. We don't want to get chucked out of here, do we?" He scrabbled for the remote and started pressing the buttons. As the volume decreased, the footage faded into view. The images on the screen were filled with green blotches of rusty-looking stains, accompanied by sounds of rustling and distorted voices. The rain had seeped through into the film, warping the footage. We watched carefully in anticipation to see the man who came out of nowhere and frightened the life out of us, but the camera did not seem to pick him up. At that point, the footage was completely destroyed. From what I recall, he looked tall and crooked, very unnatural looking with a grimacing face. Whoever it was, he was absolutely grotesque. Charlie looked frustrated. "This is crap, Joe. We could have had some actual evidence there." I told him we'd go back tomorrow and look again. Frustrated and tired, the last thing I wanted was to go back up there after what we'd experienced tonight. I think Charlie was on the same page. "Hopefully the rain stops tomorrow." "Don't worry, we'll get him," I said. He asked me if I thought it was a person. Due to the man's height and the way he looked, it wasn't a stupid question. I just looked at him with a frown combined with a shrug. We gave the screen a concerned and lingering stare as a foreboding silence filled the room. Once we got our belongings packed away, we jumped into the beds that were already prepared for us. They enveloped us with a crisp but gentle embrace. Our heads hit the pillows, and we were out for the count. The next morning, after a disjointed but satisfactory sleep, I made my way to the bar. As I went through, I saw a man dressed in raggedy-style clothes cleaning the glasses, a tea towel flung over his shoulder, and a 5 o'clock shadow at 9 a.m. It was the barman we had met yesterday, but he looked different, like he was having an off day. I gave him a hearty good morning and got the same back from him. He seemed quite friendly, the type of personality that is easy to talk to. He asked us what brought my friend and I here. I told him we were investigating Green Barn up the road. He looked anxious and muttered, "Green Barn," in a worried tone back at me. I said yes, and that we're looking into the strange sightings that have been reported up there. He replied with one concerned-sounding word. "Fletcher." He told me that Fletcher had died 20 years ago, and that he'd heard mentions from the town folk saying they'd seen his shadows on a few occasions. Apparently, he wasn't a good man by any standard. No one ever went near him after he butchered his family and managed to get away with it. He said they hardly saw him, but they knew never to go near him or his property, that those who did went missing, and that all the local residents had their suspicions. He was a grotesque-looking man, as ugly on the inside as he was out. I didn't doubt that for a second. I mentioned to the barman that we saw a tall man when we were at Green Barn last night. He looked back with wide eyes. He told me that my friend and I needed to be careful going back up there. Charlie bounded down the stairs and through to the bar, interrupting the tenseness of the moment. The barman turned away, stopped for a moment, and then swung back around with a smile. He offered us a table and that he'd grab us some menus. I thanked him and apologized if I'd mentioned something that worried him. He smiled back and said he'd be at our table in a few moments to take our order. The barman seemed like a pretty genuine guy, quite old-fashioned sounding, but caring in a rigid sort of way. The idea of breakfast was mouth-watering. I started to tell Charlie what the barman mentioned to me about the previous encounters with the tall man. He seemed more excited about it than I did. I was still pretty unnerved by the whole thing. He asked me if I knew what this meant. I stared blankly. He whispered that we'd be the first ones to document this ghost, and that we could interview locals about it too. You know, make a real documentary out of it. He said this could be a big deal if we captured him on tape. I told him anxiously that the barman said we needed to be careful up there and that it's desolate. No one ventures out there anymore. I could sense that something bad was on the horizon. I had been the main instigator of this trip, finding out about this particular case purely by word of mouth in my ghost hunter circles. We, however, were the first ones to come and investigate. In all honesty, I was starting to regret that decision. The barman plunked our breakfast down in front of us, and within a couple of minutes, we'd demolished the lot. Could have done second helpings. As I was scraping at the scraps left on my plate, a tall shadow walked past the window. Before I could process what I'd just seen, Charlie looked at me as I stared back at the window, still as a statue. He asked me what was wrong. I told him, but he brushed it off, saying, "It'll be nothing, mate. Trick of the eye," and ushering me to head out of the door and for us to ready ourselves for the walk to see the tall man. I secretly wanted to abort mission and go home, but we started this, so I guess we'll have to finish it.